Somewhere in the South Atlantic, in the autumn of 1942, a submarine ran silent at periscope depth. No friendly port within 2,000 nautical miles. No air cover. No rescue plan. Just 50 men sealed inside 87 meters of German steel, 3 months into a patrol that wouldn't end for another 4. The man on the periscope was 30 years old. He had already sunk more Allied shipping than almost any commander alive. And he was just getting started. His name was Wolfgang Lüth. By the time the Second World War ended, he had completed 15 war patrols, spent more than 600 days at sea, and sunk 46 ships, 225,000 gross register tons of Allied merchant shipping, across the North Atlantic, the South Atlantic, around the Cape of Good Hope, and deep into the Indian Ocean. He was the 7th person in the entire German armed forces to receive the Knight's Cross, with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds, the first from the Navy. He commanded his crews with a psychological precision that the Office of Naval Intelligence considered worth translating and distributing to American naval officers after the war. He was, by every documented professional metric, extraordinary. He was also shot dead by one of his own sentries, 2 weeks after Germany surrendered. In a dark courtyard outside the Naval Academy, he commanded, by an 18-year-old seaman who called out 3 times and received no answer. The most decorated submariner in the German Navy died not in the deep water he had navigated for 4 years, but on dry land, following rules he himself had enforced. This is the complete story. The patrols, the philosophy, the contradictions, and the silence on that last night in Flensburg. It starts in Riga in 1913. It ends the way no one expected. So, make yourself comfortable. This is a long one. 15 chapters. A life from Riga to Flensburg. From a boy who briefly studied law to a man who commanded submarines for the better part of 4 years without ever really stopping. The waters get cold, then warm, then cold again. The hours stretch. The depth charges come. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, there is this officer who spent his off-watch hours designing chess tournaments and debating menu rotations with his crew, while the war burned itself out above the waterline. That's the story I want to tell you. Let's begin. If you find this kind of long-form military history useful, a subscription or a like genuinely helps this channel continue. This script took considerable archival work, and the more of you that watch to the end, the more of these I can make. Now settle in. Chapter 1. The boy from Riga, Wolfgang August Eugen Lüth, was born on the 15th of October 1913 in Riga. At that moment, Riga was still part of the Russian Empire, a Baltic port city with deep German cultural roots. The community of Baltic Germans had been there for centuries, maintaining a distinct identity that was neither wholly Russian nor simply German. It was, by any account, a complicated place to be born into, particularly if you were German, because the ground beneath that identity was already shifting before the First World War even concluded. By the time Lüth was old enough to be aware of the world around him, the Latvian Republic had been proclaimed. The German community was diminished in political standing, and the certainties his grandparents had built their lives on were largely dissolved. I bring this up not as psychological diagnosis. I'm not going to claim his Baltic origins explain everything about him, but because displacement has a way of sharpening certain kinds of ambition. Lüth grew up attending the Naturwissenschaftliches Gymnasium in Riga, which was essentially a rigorous, science-oriented secondary school. He completed his Abitur, the German school-leaving certificate, and then briefly enrolled at the Herder Institute to study law. 3 semesters, that's all. Then, with his parents' approval, he left Latvia entirely and made his way to Germany to join the Reichsmarine on the 1st of April, 1933. He was 19 years old. 1933 is, obviously, a year that carries a great deal of historical weight. It was the year Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Lüth joined the Navy that same spring, and while I can't tell you with precision what his political understanding was at that specific moment, the documents don't give us his inner life at 19. What we know is that by the time he was in active command during the war, his ideological commitment was loud and documented. That's a thread I'll return to. For now, what matters is the entry point. A Baltic German with a talent for science and a brief detour through law, choosing the Navy over everything else. His early career was almost aggressively conventional in terms of structure. He underwent basic military training and was transferred to the training ship Gorch Fock, becoming a naval cadet in September of 1933. From there, he went on a 9-month training cruise around the world aboard the cruiser Karlsruhe, departing in September of 1933 and returning the following June, 9 months at sea. His first real exposure to the deep ocean, to the mechanics of navigation and seamanship at scale. It's worth noting because this kind of surface fleet formation shaped how Lüth understood the fundamentals: hull management, crew dynamics, the social architecture of a ship on a long voyage. All of it would prove directly useful later, in circumstances nobody on that training cruise could have predicted. He advanced through the ranks with steady, unremarkable pace at first. Midshipman in July of 1934, senior midshipman by April of 1936, ensign by October of the same year, after a year's service aboard the light cruiser Königsberg. In February of 1937, he made the transfer that defined the rest of his life. He moved to the U-boat arm. He would spend the next several years learning submarines from the inside out. First as a junior officer, then as a watch officer, and eventually as a commander whose methods would become the subject of a formal lecture delivered to the entire senior officer corps of the German Navy. I sometimes think about what the transition from surface ship to submarine felt like for men of that generation. The Karlsruhe was over 150 meters long, a relatively large vessel with open decks, natural light, weather you could read with your own eyes. A Type I U-boat, by comparison, was roughly 43 meters. No natural light below the waterline, recycled air, the sound of the hull working under pressure, different skills entirely, and different psychological demands. Lüth didn't just adapt, he thrived. But that took time, and the road to U-181, to the record patrol, to the diamonds on his Knight's Cross, to the lecture at Weimar, started with years of gradual incremental competence, not a single moment of revelation. That's how most real military careers actually work. Not a pivot point, an accumulation. Chapter 2. First Waters, U-27, U-38, and the road to command. Before Wolfgang Lüth ever had a submarine of his own, he spent 2 years learning how other men commanded them. This is an aspect of his story that tends to get compressed in popular accounts, which jump straight to his tonnage figures and his decorations. But those years as a watch officer, first on U-27, then on U-38, shaped the specific kind of commander he became. You don't develop an intuitive understanding of crew dynamics, of fatigue and morale, of how a boat moves and what it needs, without having watched it all from the side. In July of 1938, Lüth was appointed second watch officer of U-27. He was 24 years old and had been an ensign for less than 2 years. The assignment lasted 3.5 months, from the 3rd of July to the 23rd of October, 1938. This was a Type I U-boat, the backbone of the German submarine fleet, and U-27 was still in its peacetime operational mode, which meant exercises, drills, technical familiarization. No combat, but absolutely the place where habits form. How you respond to a sudden alarm, how quickly you get to your station, whether the crew trusts the chain of command when things go wrong at 2 in the morning. The next significant assignment came in April of 1939. Lüth sailed on the U-boat tender Erwin Wassner in Spanish waters, observing operations during the final phase of the Spanish Civil War. This, too, tends to get a footnote in his biography, but it shouldn't. The Spanish waters deployment was where German naval personnel gained direct operational experience, not training exercises, but real-world conditions. The navigation, the political complexity of operating in territorial waters, where allegiances were fractured and the rules of engagement were anything but clean. He was there from the 13th of April to the 18th of May, 1939. 5 weeks, not long, but formative. By October of 1939, with the war already underway, having formally begun in September, Lüth was serving as first watch officer aboard U-38 under Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Lieber. The timing matters. U-38 had departed Wilhelmshaven on the 19th of August, 1939, patrolling the western approaches before returning to base on the 18th of September, which means Lüth was at sea in the western approaches in the opening weeks of the Atlantic War. He was watching Lieb work a U-boat in live conditions, watching how a commander handles the bridge at night, how he manages the approach, how he decides when to commit and when to back off. Lieb was good enough that he would eventually earn his own Knight's Cross with oak leaves. Lüth had a capable template. What I find interesting about this period, looking back through the records, is how deliberately Lüth's career was structured toward independent command. The German U-boat training pipeline of the late 1930s was not especially long. Men were expected to absorb a great deal quickly. The war compressed everything further. By the time U-boat attrition began to climb, in the middle years of the conflict, there was a severe shortage of experienced commanders. The men who had done their apprenticeships carefully, like Lüth, became the foundational officers of an expanding fleet. Their methods were not just personal preference. They became doctrine. In the broader historiographical picture, the period between 1938 and December of 1939 represents what you might call the invisible years of Lüth's career. No patrols under his own name, no tonnage credited, just the steady accumulation of watch-standing hours, mechanical knowledge, and the particular social skill of reading a crew, knowing which petty officer is about to crack, which young seaman is quietly struggling, which veteran needs to be kept busy so his fear doesn't become contagious. That skill, which Lüth would later codify in remarkable detail in his Weimar lecture, wasn't something he discovered in command. He developed it watching other men lead and quietly noting what worked and what didn't. By the end of 1939, he was ready, or as ready as anyone is, at 26, to be handed a submarine in the middle of a war. Chapter 3, U-9 and the First Kills. On the 30th of December 1939, Wolfgang Lüth took command of U-9. She was a Type IXD U-boat, small, coastal, not designed for the long Atlantic patrols that would define his later career. 42 meters of pressure hull, a diving time, when everything was working, of somewhere around 30 seconds. A maximum endurance under ideal conditions of roughly 3,100 nautical miles at surface speed. Not a deep ocean hunter. A boat for the Baltic, for the approaches, for the work that needed doing close to shore. But it was his boat, his first command, and he ran 6 war patrols on her. The early patrols on U-9 established a pattern that would repeat itself throughout Lüth's career. Steady, almost methodical accumulation of results, combined with occasional moments of operational improvisation that distinguished him from commanders who simply followed the playbook. In January of 1940, U-9 sank the Swedish merchant vessel Flandria. The circumstances were unusual. A smoke float ignited prematurely during what was a surface attack, and the attack itself was carried out with crew members standing on the bridge watching. This is documented in Vors's biography and in the Wikipedia record of the boat. It's a small detail, but I find it telling. Lüth let his men watch. He understood early that shared experience, seeing the result of an action, not just being told about it afterward, had a measurable effect on crew cohesion and morale. This wasn't sentimentality. It was method. The most historically significant event of the U-9 period was the sinking of the French submarine Doris on the night of the 8th to 9th of May, 1940. This was a surface engagement at night. The Doris was a Requin-class submarine on patrol as part of French naval operations in the North Sea. Lüth identified her, made his approach, and sank her. This was Lüth's first warship kill, and it remains a rare documented instance of one submarine sinking another during the Second World War. The credit is clearly established. The Doris is listed in every major accounting of Lüth's career, from the Wikipedia article to the Naval Institute records, from the summary provided by the U-Boat Archive lecture introduction. Around the same time, there was an attack that didn't go as planned. On the 20th of April 1940, U-9 attacked the Polish destroyer Orp Błyskawica. The torpedoes malfunctioned and detonated in the destroyer's wake. The Błyskawica escaped undamaged. This matters because it speaks to something that I think gets underplayed in histories of the U-boat war. Torpedo reliability was an ongoing problem in the early years of the conflict. German magnetic detonators were notoriously unreliable in high-latitude waters, particularly near magnetic anomalies. The technical failure at the Błyskawica wasn't a failure of tactics. The boat was in position. The approach was sound. The hardware let the crew down. By the time Lüth handed over U-9, she had accumulated 7 merchant ship sinkings totaling 16,669 gross registered tons, plus the Doris. Those numbers look modest against his later career totals. But in 1940, in a coastal boat operating in the constrained waters of the North Sea and western approaches, they were the product of real skill and consistently aggressive decision-making. The 6 patrols also gave Lüth something invaluable: a fully formed command style. He knew how he wanted to run a boat. He knew what daily routine looked like under extended patrol conditions. He knew how to read a crew under stress. On the 27th of June 1940, he was given U-138. The next chapter of the story had begun. Chapter 4, U-138 and the Knight's Cross. If the U-9 period was Lüth finding his feet as a commander, the U-138 patrol period was the moment the wider German naval establishment began to take notice. U-138 was a Type IID submarine, still a coastal boat, marginally larger than U-9, still not the long-range platform that would define his record-breaking work later. He took command on the 27th of June, 1940, and ran 2 patrols with her before being given a far more capable vessel. The first patrol on U-138 was, by the standards of the U-boat war in 1940, exceptional. 4 ships sunk, 34,644 gross register tons, in a single patrol in a coastal submarine. The year, 1940, represented something historians sometimes call the first happy time of the U-boat campaign. Allied convoy defenses were still relatively thin. Anti-submarine technology was being developed under urgency, and experienced U-boat commanders were finding the Atlantic shipping lanes in the western approaches and the channel almost dangerously accessible. Lüth wasn't just a beneficiary of favorable conditions, though. The decisions that produced 4 sinkings required sustained aggression and tactical confidence. The second patrol on U-138 is more complicated to assess. The recorded action includes a missed attack on the Norwegian merchant steamer Dagrun, the sinking of the British merchant steamer Bonheur, and the damaging of the British motor tanker British Glory. Here's where the archival record gets a little interesting. The German authorities initially believed they had credit for sinking the British Glory outright. Based on that belief, Lüth was nominated for the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, which he was formally awarded on the 24th of October, 1940. In the radio announcement, the German Naval Command credited him with sinking 12 ships and one submarine, totaling 87,236 tons. The actual documented figure at that point was considerably lower. 51,316 gross register tons through late September, rising to 56,643 GRT by mid-October. I don't raise this to diminish the decoration or suggest wrongdoing. This kind of discrepancy between claimed and confirmed tonnage was endemic to the U-boat war. In the heat of operations, with imperfect battle damage assessment, commanders and their headquarters regularly overcounted. The German Naval Command had structural incentives for optimism in claims. What the gap does tell us is that we need to be careful throughout any accounting of the U-boat war about treating German tonnage claims as ground truth. The numbers in the documented record, assembled through post-war analysis, are considerably more reliable than the wartime announcements. Lüth received the Knight's Cross then. He was 26 years old, in command of a coastal submarine, and had just become one of the decorated combat officers of the German Navy. This was a significant social and institutional shift, not just a personal one. Knight's Cross recipients occupied a different status within the military hierarchy. They were profiled in the press. They were held up as examples. They became, whether they sought it or not, representations of what the U-boat service was supposed to stand for. Lüth would navigate that status with apparent ease, but it came with pressures of its own, a constant need to perform, to justify the decoration through continued results, to remain relevant as the war changed around him. On the 21st of October 1940, he was given U-43. This was an entirely different kind of boat. Chapter 5 U-43, and the long Atlantic grind U-43 was a Type X U-boat, long range, ocean-going, a boat that could reach the mid-Atlantic, the West African coast, waters that the Type II coastal submarines couldn't approach without running dry of fuel, at over 76 meters in length, roughly double the size of U-9. She was a different machine entirely, with a different operational calculus. More fuel capacity meant longer patrols. Longer patrols meant the psychological management of a crew at sea for months, not weeks. And that distinction, it turns out, was exactly where Lüth's particular talents most applied. He ran 5 patrols on U-43, accumulating 204 days at sea, and sinking 12 ships totaling 64,852 gross register tons. That's a substantial haul. It's also worth noting what those 5 patrols represented in terms of experience. Extensive time in the North Atlantic, exposure to the evolving Allied anti-submarine response, and the operational challenge of keeping a boat and a crew functional over extended periods in hostile conditions. On the 1st of January 1941, Lüth was promoted to Captain Lieutenant. The UG-43 period wasn't without its low moments. On the 4th of February 1941, U-43 sank while tied to a floating pier in Lorient, a French port that had become the operational base for much of the German Atlantic U-boat force. This is an extraordinary incident, and it's documented in both Vors's biography and the Wikipedia record. Valves and vents had been tampered with the previous day. A hatch had been left open contrary to a standing BDU directive. BDU being the U-boat command headquarters. Befehlshaber der U-Boot, and water entered the aft torpedo room slowly, steadily, until the boat went down at the pier. 2 petty officers were found most at fault. But Lüth, as commanding officer, bore ultimate responsibility. What happened next is revealing. According to Vors, no record of any formal punishment of Lüth has survived. His career doesn't appear to have been negatively affected. The boat was refloated, put right, and Lüth took her back to sea in May of 1941. I find this episode interesting, not because it reflects badly on him. Commanding officers carry institutional responsibility for events that are proximately the fault of junior personnel. And the degree of personal blame in a peacetime accident is genuinely difficult to apportion. But because it shows how the German naval hierarchy valued proven combat performers, a commander with a Knight's Cross and a demonstrated record of results could weather a dockside incident that might have ended a less decorated officer's career before it started. Lüth was also tasked during the U-43 period with training future U-boat commanders. This was common practice for senior and experienced officers. Trainees would accompany patrols as their final exercise before receiving independent command. Lüth trained Erich Würdemann, among others. This role, mentor, model, evaluator, fed directly into what would later become his formal articulation of leadership philosophy. He wasn't just learning how to command, he was being asked to transmit commandership to others, which forces a different kind of self-examination. You can't teach what you haven't named, and naming it, Lüth was already very good at. The strategic picture around U-43's patrol schedule was shifting dramatically during this period. The summer and autumn of 1941 saw the Allied anti-submarine capability beginning to improve in ways that were not yet fully visible at the level of individual patrol results, but that were accumulating in the background. HFDF, high-frequency direction finding, was becoming more capable. The Royal Navy's escort groups were gaining experience. Convoy routing was becoming more sophisticated. The so-called first happy time was winding down, replaced by harder hunts, longer searches, and tighter Allied air coverage over the eastern Atlantic. Lüth and U-43 were operating in this changing environment, and his results, while solid, reflected the increased difficulty of the work. In January of 1942, he was ordered to return U-43 to Germany for an overhaul. By May, he had a new boat, U-181, and everything that came before was, in a sense, preparation. Chapter 6, U-181, and the First South Atlantic Patrol. On the 9th of May 1942, Wolfgang Lüth took command of U-181. She was a Type IXD-2, a long-range variant specifically designed for extended patrols in distant waters. Where a standard Type IX had real endurance, the IXD-2 extended that concept to its logical conclusion. A boat that could reach the Indian Ocean, patrol for weeks, and return. At nearly 87 meters and capable of carrying fuel and provisions for patrols measured in months rather than weeks. U-181 was one of the most capable submarines the German Navy operated. She was built for exactly the kind of deep, solitary hunting that Lüth had been working toward since his days on the coastal boats. The first patrol departed from Kiel in September of 1942. Destination, the Indian Ocean, with a primary operating area off the coast of South Africa and the sea lanes approaching Cape Town. This was not a random assignment. By the second half of 1942, Allied anti-submarine measures in the North Atlantic were substantially more developed than they had been in 1940 or early 1941. The trade-off offered by the far southern Atlantic and the Indian Ocean was straightforward. Allied convoy escort was thinner, air cover was sparse, and the shipping lanes off Cape Town and through the Mozambique Channel carried significant strategic traffic. It was, bluntly, where the hunting still worked. Lüth reached the sea lanes outside Cape Town in October of 1942. He spent approximately a month patrolling the area. On the 13th of November, while still at sea, he received a signal informing him that he had been awarded the Knight's Cross with oak leaves. The 142nd recipient of that particular grade of the decoration. He was at the far end of the world, several months into a patrol, and the award arrived as a radio message from headquarters. There's something distinctly modern about that, actually. A commendation delivered via Morse code in the South Atlantic. 2 days later, U-181 was heavily damaged. The British destroyer HMS Inconstant found her, and what followed was an engagement that lasted 9 hours. 9 hours. That's not a brief contact. That's a sustained hunt, depth charges and evasion, and the slow attrition of a boat's systems under pressure, in water far from any friendly port. Lüth eventually escaped. He repaired the boat. Some accounts suggest this involved improvised repair work at sea and led U-181 to Lourenço, the port in Portuguese East Africa that is now Maputo in Mozambique. From there, over the following fortnight, U-181 conducted a series of surface attacks that sank 8 ships, most of them engaged primarily with the boat's deck gun rather than torpedoes. When your torpedo inventory is depleted or your internal systems are compromised, a deck gun becomes your most reliable weapon. Lüth used his effectively. By January of 1943, U-181 returned to Bordeaux after sinking 12 ships totaling 58,381 gross register tons. This was a remarkable patrol result by any standard. The crew had been at sea for months, crossed the Atlantic, rounded Africa, survived a 9-hour engagement with a British destroyer, conducted repairs under operational conditions, and returned with a substantial tally. On the 31st of January 1943, Lüth and other Kriegsmarine officers travelled to the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's field headquarters at Rastenburg, for the formal Oak Leaves presentation. The flight back to Berlin became historically significant for reasons unrelated to Lüth. It was during that return journey that Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz informed the officers present that he had been appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine, following the resignation of Ryder. History, sometimes, is just something that happens around you while you're on a plane. I want to pause here and say something about what this first U-181 patrol represents in the structure of this story. By the end of it, Lüth had been in active U-boat service for roughly 6 years. He had commanded 5 boats. He had spent hundreds of days at sea in conditions that ranged from miserable to genuinely dangerous. And he was heading into his most technically significant patrol, 205 days at sea, the second longest combat patrol of the Second World War, as a man who had already pushed the limits of what submarine endurance looked like. The record patrol on U-181 was not a surprise in retrospect. It was where the career had been pointing all along. Chapter 7, The Record Patrol, 205 days. On the 23rd of March 1943, U-181 departed on her second war patrol under Wolfgang Lüth's command. She would not return until the 14th of October 1943. 205 days. That is not a misprint. More than 6.5 months at sea, in a submarine, without returning to a friendly port. The longest combat patrol conducted under a single commander during the entire Second World War. The longest, at 225 days, was Eitel Friedrich Kentrat aboard U-196. But Kentrat's patrol encompassed a boat relief at sea. Lüth's was continuous under his own command. The distinction matters, and it's one that historians of the U-boat war are careful about when making comparisons. The patrol's operating area was the Indian Ocean, the waters around Mauritius, the sea lanes between the Cape of Good Hope and the Mozambique Channel, the traffic corridors that fed Allied supply lines into the Middle East and up the East African coast. This was distant water warfare in the truest sense. The nearest German-controlled port was thousands of nautical miles away. If something failed, machinery, crew health, the hull, there were no options that didn't involve significant improvisation, and things did fail. They always do, over 200 days. The question was what you did when they failed. In the early weeks of the patrol, U-181 operated south of Lourenço Marques and toward Durban, an area that had already proven productive on the first patrol. 3 ships were sunk in this initial phase. Then, in June of 1943, came one of the more unusual episodes of the entire U-boat war, a mid-ocean rendezvous east of Mauritius between 6 submarines. U-181 met U-177, U-178, U-196, U-197, and U-198 alongside the supply ship Charlotte Schliemann to refuel. The commanders were Robert Geise, Wilhelm Doms, Eitel Friedrich Kentrat, Robert Bartels, and Werner Hartmann. Almost a conference of distant water specialists. According to the Wikipedia record, the commanders exchanged operational experiences and discussed the chronic problem of torpedo reliability failures. I find this meeting compelling, not for its tactical significance, but for what it reveals about the isolation of Indian Ocean operations. 6 submarines meeting in the middle of nowhere, comparing notes on malfunctioning torpedoes, before disappearing again into the vast blue. In July, Lüth led U-181 west toward Madagascar was ordered back toward Mauritius, and on the 15th of July, 1943, sank the British collier Empire Lake. The entry Lüth made in his logbook at that time was noted by historians and recorded in the Wikipedia article. 5 survivors left floating on wreckage, 180 miles from land, with high seas running. Lüth wrote that they would probably not be saved. This is not a comfortable sentence to read. It sits there in the documented record without softening, and I'm not going to soften it here either. Lüth did not manufacture the conditions of a war that placed merchant sailors in those waters, but he also wrote that sentence with what appears to be clinical detachment, and it tells us something real about the man. Something that doesn't fit neatly into the portrait of the thoughtful, humane commander that his lecture at Weimar projects. Both are true. On the 9th of August, 1943, while still at sea, still on the same patrol, Lüth received a radio signal notifying him that he had been awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds. He was the 7th person in the entire German armed forces to receive this decoration. He was the first member of the Navy. Of the 27 total recipients across all branches throughout the entire war, most were Luftwaffe pilots or army generals. The U-boat arm produced exactly 2, Lüth and, later, Albrecht Brandy. The signal reached him in the middle of the Indian Ocean, during the longest patrol of his career. He received the highest decoration in the German military hierarchy, with his boat submerged and several weeks of patrol remaining. After the patrol, Lüth nominated 2 of his own crew members for the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. Chief Engineer Kapitänleutnant Karl August Landfermann and Second Watch Officer Johannes Limbach both received the award. This act of upward nomination is documented in the Wikipedia record of the patrol, and it's entirely consistent with everything else we know about how Lüth ran a boat. He understood that a submarine's performance was not the product of a single man's decisions. It was the product of every man keeping his nerve, doing his job, maintaining the machinery, tolerating the pressure. Recognizing Landfermann and Limbach wasn't generosity, it was accuracy. 205 days. 10 ships sunk on that patrol alone, totaling 45,331 gross register tons. Lüth arrived back at Bordeaux in October of 1943 as a Korvettenkapitän. He had been promoted while at sea. On the 1st of April 1943, the patrol was over. The boat needed extensive repair, and someone, somewhere in the senior officer corps of the Kriegsmarine, decided that the man who had just completed that patrol and could articulate how he'd done it was worth putting in front of an audience. Chapter 8, The Weimar Lecture. Problems of Leadership in a submarine. On the 17th of December 1943, Wolfgang Lüth stood before a convention of German naval officers at Weimar and delivered a lecture titled Problems of Leadership in a Submarine. He was 30 years old. He had just completed the second longest combat patrol in the history of submarine warfare. And what he said that afternoon was so specific, so detailed, and so devoid of abstraction that it reads less like a lecture and more like the working notes of a man who had spent 4 years paying very close attention. The lecture was later translated by the Office of Naval Intelligence. The own eye translation is the one that survives in the U-boat archive, and the archive's introduction notes that the translation is imperfect, but conveys the essential shape of Lüth's thinking. I've read it carefully. What strikes me most is its granularity. Lüth didn't come to Weimar with principles. He came with anecdotes. He described what happened when a crew went weeks without a kill. He described the management of punishment on a long patrol where you couldn't use a brig. He described what it felt like, in his words, to stand on the bridge of a surface submarine in the middle of a convoy at night. Slowing down, he said, because he who thinks slowly must go slowly. That specific sentence, in a lecture to senior naval officers, is extraordinary. It's the opposite of bravado. What Lüth identified as the 5 foundations of crew morale is worth quoting directly, because it's one of the most precise operational frameworks for human management that I've encountered in military documentation of the Second World War. Discipline aboard. Success. If a commander is successful, his crew will love him more, even if he is a numbskull. A well-organized daily routine. The example and correct attitude of officers. And the 5th point, real spiritual leadership for the men, together with a genuine concern for their personal welfare. 5 factors. In order. From a man who had just returned from 205 days at sea. The practical systems he described in the lecture are equally revealing. He ran a ship's newspaper, a bulletin board, really, but one that published patrol scores, chess tournament results, punishment notices, even sample letters home. He held baking competitions among crew members who were professional bakers, giving each new loaf of bread so much publicity over the radio and in the ship's paper that it could not have been done better at the Reichstag elections. He organized Sunday routines with specific record music, beginning, he noted, with the song, "Yes, this is my Sunday fun, to stay in bed at least until 10, and ending always with the same evening hymn sung by the Regensburg Cathedral Choir. He controlled fruit and chocolate personally, distributing them as earned rewards rather than routine rations. These aren't the instincts of a bureaucrat. These are the instincts of a man who understood that morale is made of small things, accumulated daily. His approach to discipline during long patrols is particularly striking. He could not use a brig at sea, impractical and pointless on a voyage of months. Instead, he developed a range of alternative measures. Sleeping without a mattress or blanket in lieu of a brig sentence, deprivation of smoking privileges, the withdrawal of a card player's scat game for 3 days, what he described as the silent treatment. Nobody speaking to an offender for a set period, then restoring full comradeship when the time was served, with no residual grudge. He was careful about this last point. He must feel that in the end, he is appreciated as an equal among comrades. The system was calibrated to correct without destroying, to maintain social cohesion rather than shatter it. On a boat where 50 men lived together for 7 months, that calibration wasn't optional. It was structural. There's a passage in the lecture that I keep returning to, because it sits uncomfortably alongside everything else. Lüth describes the officer's mess, the importance of esprit de corps, the necessity of maintaining standards. And then, in the same register, he says that he doesn't permit his young officers to listen to American or British jazz. Not because of musical preference, he says, but because they simply must not like it, just as a German man must not like a Jewess. The lecture was delivered at a convention of officers in December of 1943. Lüth said this to an audience of his peers and seniors, apparently without hesitation. The U-Boat Archive's introduction to the translation acknowledges this directly. The lecture is not comfortable reading. That is a careful understatement. The reception of the lecture after the war is genuinely interesting. American naval officer Edward L. Beach, later the author of the novel Run Silent, Run Deep, and himself a distinguished submarine commander, reportedly read the Onai translation and found Lüth's leadership techniques broadly admirable, even as the ideological content made the document deeply uncomfortable. That double response is, I think, the honest one. You can't extract the useful parts and pretend the other parts aren't there. They're in the same document, delivered in the same voice, on the same afternoon in Weimar. That's the reality of the source, and that's the reality of the man. Chapter 9. After the deep water, the shore commands. When U-181 came back to Bordeaux in October of 1943, Wolfgang Lüth's operational career as a submarine commander was functionally over, though he didn't know it yet. He had completed 15 war patrols across 9 submarines, actually 5 boats, and spent in excess of 600 days at sea. The math on that is worth sitting with for a moment. More than 600 days submerged or on the surface of hostile waters, accumulated over 4 years. That is not a number that maps onto any peacetime professional standard. That is sustained, compounding exposure to operational stress at a level that the human nervous system was not designed to maintain indefinitely. In January of 1944, Lüth was assigned command of the 22nd U-boat flotilla at Gottenhafen, present-day Gdynia, in what is now Poland. The 22nd flotilla was a training unit. Its purpose was to produce U-boat commanders for the expanding fleet. This was, in the broader context of the U-boat war in early 1944, an increasingly grim assignment. The Battle of the Atlantic had decisively turned against Germany in May of 1943, what historians mark as Black May, the month when U-boat losses became so catastrophic that Dönitz temporarily withdrew the wolf packs from the North Atlantic. The men being trained at Gottenhafen were heading into a war that had become a very different proposition from the one Lüth had entered in 1939. Training commands are not glamorous. They don't produce tonnage figures or medal nominations. What they produce is the next generation of officers, which means the quality of what you put in front of trainees has direct operational consequences. Lüth brought the Weimar Lectures framework to this role. The same granular attention to daily routine, to officer example, to the management of morale under sustained stress. He was, by all accounts, a rigorous and demanding training commander. He also brought his ideology, which was by this point openly and consistently expressed. The war was going badly. The political situation in Germany was deteriorating. And Lüth, unlike many officers who quietly moderated their public commitments as the tide turned, remained outspoken. In July of 1944, he moved again, this time to take command of the 1st Department of the Naval Academy Mürwik at Flensburg. On the 1st of August 1944, he was promoted to Fregattenkapitän. On the 1st of September 1944, he became commander of the entire academy. Same day, promoted to Kapitän zur See, the full 4-ring rank of a naval captain. He was 30 years old. These are rapid promotions, and they reflect both the accelerating attrition of senior officers across the German military and the genuine institutional regard in which Lüth was held. The Naval Academy Mürwik was not a peripheral assignment. It was the primary training institution for Kriegsmarine officers. Giving it to a 30-year-old with diamonds on his Knight's Cross was a statement about what the Navy thought of him. Mürwik itself is a striking building. It sits on the western bank of the Flensburg Fjord, a red brick naval school built in the early 20th century. And by the autumn of 1944, it was operating in circumstances that defied any conventional definition of institutional stability. Allied forces were advancing from the west. The war economy was collapsing. Fuel shortages were affecting training schedules. The men arriving for officer training were younger than they'd ever been, with less time to give them before they were needed. Lüth ran the academy anyway, with apparent energy and the same organizational specificity he had applied to a submarine at 50 meters depth in the Indian Ocean. The setting had changed entirely. The methods hadn't. What we don't have from the documented record is a clear interior picture of Lüth in these final months. The lecture at Weimar is the most extended first-person document we have from him, and it's from December of 1943, before the shore assignments, before the full collapse of 1945. Vorza's biography addresses his final period, but even there the picture is constructed from external observation. We don't know exactly what Lüth made of the final phase of the war, the failed July assassination attempt on Hitler, the collapse of Army Group Center, the loss of the Baltic ports one by one. He was ideologically committed enough that we shouldn't assume private doubt. But we also can't assume certainty. The archive doesn't give us that. I won't fabricate it. Chapter 10, Flensburg at the End of the World. By the spring of 1945, Flensburg was one of the last functional pockets of German governmental authority remaining. On the 30th of April, 1945, Adolf Hitler died in Berlin. Karl Dönitz, who had commanded the U-boat service since 1935 and the entire Kriegsmarine since January of 1943, was named Reich President in Hitler's political testament. This was not a role Dönitz had sought, and by every subsequent account, he understood its meaning primarily in terms of one task: negotiating the most orderly possible end to the war, particularly to allow German forces in the east to fall westward and surrender to British or American forces rather than to Soviet ones. Flensburg became, briefly and surreally, the seat of what historians call the Flensburg government, the Rump administration that operated from the Mürwik Naval Academy under Dönitz between the 2nd and the 23rd of May, 1945. This is the context in which Lüth's final days played out. He was the commandant of the building that had become, in effect, Germany's last seat of government. Dönitz was there. Grand Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeburg was there. The Academy's routines continued as the Allied occupation tightened around them. British forces occupied Flensburg on the 5th of May. Initially, according to the Wikipedia record, nothing changed in the daily routine at the Academy. The sentries remained on post. The password challenge remained in effect. The Germany that Lüth had served since 1933 was, by May of 1945, in a condition that defied any conventional military or institutional category. The war in Europe formally ended on the 8th of May. The Flensburg government continued to exist, technically, until the 23rd of May, when British forces dissolved it and arrested its members. For those 15 days, a strange liminal period existed where German governmental structures persisted inside a country that had unconditionally surrendered. The Naval Academy continued to operate. The sentries continued their shifts. And Wolfgang Lüth continued to walk the grounds of the institution he commanded. I want to pause and sit with this a moment, because it's easy to rush past it, and I think it deserves attention. Consider what it meant to be a German officer in that specific period, between the 8th and the 14th of May, 1945. The war was over. The cause for which you had fought, whatever your private assessment of it, had collapsed utterly. The institutions that had defined your adult life had either surrendered or dissolved, and yet the day continued. The sentries stood their posts. The passwords were issued and challenged. The machinery of military routine persisted because it was the only structure left. Stopping it would require a decision, and in the absence of new orders, the old ones continued. On the night of the 13th of May, 1945, 5 days after Germany's formal surrender, 5 days after the guns stopped, Wolfgang Lüth walked through the grounds of the Mürwik Naval Academy. It was dark. The sentries were in position. The challenge procedure was in effect. A sentry would call out. The approaching person was expected to provide the password, and absence of a response triggered a defined escalation. Lüth was returning. The Wikipedia article describes him as returning drunk. He did not respond to the challenge. The sentry, an 18-year-old seaman named Matthias Gottlob, called out 3 times. No response came. He could not visually identify the figure in the darkness. He fired his rifle from the hip, without aiming, in accordance with his orders and training. The bullet struck Lüth in the head. He died. The officer in charge immediately reported the incident and contacted Dönitz. Dönitz's adjutant, receiving the call, initially believed it was a joke. Then, understanding it wasn't, the adjutant called Lüth's brother, Joachim, who was staying nearby, and it was Joachim who told Lüth's wife and their 4 children that he was dead. Wolfgang Lüth was 31 years old. He had survived the North Atlantic. He had survived 9 hours of depth charging in the South Atlantic. He had survived 205 days in the Indian Ocean. He was shot by one of his own sentries, following procedures he himself had enforced, in a country that had already surrendered. The court-martial convened at Dönitz's order and was completed quickly. Seaman Gottlob gave his account. He had challenged 3 times. He had not been able to identify the person approaching. He had fired in accordance with standing orders. The watch leader confirmed the sequence of events. The court ruled that Gottlob was not guilty and cleared him of any fault, whatever weight you want to assign to that ruling. And the circumstances of a German military court ruling in the final days of the Flensburg government are their own complicated historical question. The documented factual account is clear. The rules were followed. The outcome was fatal. Chapter 11. The State Funeral and the Question of Legacy. On the 16th of May, 1945, Wolfgang Lüth was given a state funeral. Karl Dönitz, serving as Reichspräsident, Hitler's designated successor in the final days of the German government, operating under Allied supervision in Flensburg, delivered the eulogy. The British commander of Flensburg had been formally asked for permission to hold the funeral and had granted approval by royal assent. It was the last state funeral of the Third Reich. Lüth received full military honours within a week of the formal end of the war he had fought for 4 years. What Dönitz said in the eulogy is not something I have the full documented text of, so I won't reconstruct it or invent its content. What I can say is that the decision to hold a formal state funeral for Lüth in those specific circumstances was itself a statement. Dönitz understood the symbolic weight of military ceremony, and he chose to deploy it for the man who had been the first naval recipient of the diamonds. The funeral wasn't just grief. It was institutional assertion, an insistence that the naval traditions and hierarchies that had governed Lüth's career retained meaning even in unconditional surrender. Whether that insistence was earned, or appropriate, or useful, is a separate question from whether it happened. It happened. The question of Lüth's legacy is genuinely unresolved, and I think it's worth being honest about why. On a purely quantitative accounting, his career statistics are remarkable. 46 merchant ships sunk, 1 submarine destroyed, 225,204 gross register tons of shipping, the longest patrol under continuous command in the Second World War. 15 war patrols across 5 boats, the 7th recipient of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords and diamonds, the first from the Navy. These facts are documented and confirmed by post-war research, not inflated wartime claims. The leadership framework he articulated at Weimar has attracted genuine interest from naval historians and military leadership scholars. Jordan Vaz, whose biography remains the standard English language source, treats the leadership methods seriously, even as he engages with the ideological content honestly. Edward Beech's reported admiration for the lecture's practical sections is a specific and documented instance of a distinguished Allied naval officer finding real value in what an adversary documented. These aren't minor acknowledgements. They represent a professional tradition, the study of effective military leadership, engaging honestly with a source that is also morally complex. And then there is the other side of the ledger, the sentence in the logbook about the 5 survivors of the Empire Lake, floating on wreckage 180 miles from land, who would probably not be saved. The lecture passage about jazz and Jewishness, the consistent, documented ideological commitment that persisted not as private belief, but as public expression throughout his career. The German author Franz Kurowski's post-war hagiography, published under the pen name Karl Allman, which Canadian historian Michael Hadley described in his 1995 study as hackwork, and Pulp Trade Yarn, focused on hero making, tried to clean the record into something uncomplicated. The actual record is not uncomplicated. I find at the end of working through this material that the most useful thing I can say about Lüth's legacy is probably this. He is not a figure who becomes more coherent the longer you look at him. He becomes less coherent. The leadership methods and the ideology were not separate compartments in his life. They coexisted in the same lecture, delivered in the same voice, on the same December afternoon in Weimar. He was a gifted manager of men under extreme conditions, who was simultaneously an adherent of a regime that industrialized human destruction. Both are documented. Neither cancels the other out. That's not a satisfying conclusion, but then this history didn't earn a satisfying conclusion. His wife and 4 children survived him. The sentry who shot him was exonerated. The boat he had commanded, U-181, was surrendered to the Japanese Navy after the German capitulation. She had been in Batavia, present-day Jakarta, when the war ended, and was recommissioned as I-501 under Japanese colors. She was scuttled in August of 1945 after Japan's own surrender, not quite 3 months after Lüth died in a dark courtyard in Flensburg. The war ended. The boats went down. The record, such as it is, remains. Chapter 12. The U-boat war in strategic context. Wolfgang Lüth did not fight a personal war. He fought inside a vast strategic campaign whose dimensions were entirely beyond any single commander's awareness. And understanding where his career sits within that campaign requires stepping back from the patrols and the tonnage figures and looking at the bigger picture. The Battle of the Atlantic, which was not a single engagement, but the longest sustained military campaign of the Second World War. It ran from the 3rd of September, 1939, the day Britain declared war on Germany, continuously until the 8th of May, 1945. That is 5 years and 8 months without a single day in which merchant ships were not at risk somewhere in the Atlantic. The strategic logic of the U-boat campaign was straightforward and had been clearly articulated by Admiral Karl Dönitz long before the war began. Britain was an island nation. Its war economy and its ability to sustain the civilian population depended entirely on ocean supply lines. Interrupt those supply lines sufficiently, and Britain would be forced into negotiation or collapse. The arithmetic seemed to support the idea. If more tonnage could be sunk each month than the Allies could build and man, the campaign was theoretically winnable. This tonnage war concept drove German strategic planning for the Atlantic right through to 1943. What the German strategic calculation consistently underestimated was the industrial capacity of the United States and the organizational resilience of the Allied merchant marine and naval response. In 1942, the year Lüth was transitioning from U-43 to U-181, more Allied tonnage was sunk than in any other single year of the war. More than 6 million gross register tons, including devastating losses off the American eastern seaboard in the early months of the year, before the US Navy introduced effective convoy systems. But the Allies were also building. American shipyards, running in shifts around the clock, were producing Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them. The production equation was shifting underneath the tactical picture. May of 1943, Black May, is the hinge point that historians consistently identify. In that single month, the German U-boat arm lost 41 submarines. The previous monthly record had been 15. Dönitz had approximately 120 U-boats operational in the North Atlantic at the time. Losing 41 in 31 days was not sustainable by any calculation. On the 24th of May, 1943, Dönitz ordered the wolf packs to withdraw from the North Atlantic. Not tactically redeployment. Withdrawal. It was an acknowledgement, in operational terms, that the central campaign had been lost. The U-boats went south, to the Indian Ocean, to the waters Lüth was already operating in, but the strategic window had closed. What broke the U-boats was a convergence of technological and organizational factors, rather than any single weapon or decision. High-frequency direction finding, HFDF, or HUFDUF, allowed Allied ships and shore stations to locate surface submarines from their radio transmissions. The U-boats had to communicate with headquarters, and every transmission was a potential fix. Long-range aircraft, particularly the consolidated B-24 Liberator, closed the mid-Atlantic air gap, the stretch of ocean that had previously been beyond land-based aircraft coverage. Radar improved until it could detect a surfaced submarine's conning tower in darkness or fog. Centimetric radar, operating on 10-centimeter wavelengths, was invisible to the German Metox radar detector that U-boat crews relied on for warning. Allied crews were getting detections before U-boat commanders had any indication they were being hunted. Lüth's Indian Ocean deployment in 1942 and 1943 existed partly as a consequence of this technological pressure. The remote waters of the South Atlantic and Indian Ocean still offered hunting in contexts where Allied air coverage was thin and HF-DF coverage was patchy, but even those waters were not permanent sanctuaries. Allied naval and air presence expanded steadily southward and eastward through 1943 and 1944. The distant waterboats found the margins of safety shrinking. What had been a productive operational area in late 1942 became progressively more dangerous through 1943. And by 1944, the Indian Ocean was no longer the reliable alternative it had briefly represented. By the war's end, the total cost of the U-boat campaign was staggering in every direction. Allied losses stood at more than 2,600 merchant ships, totaling over 30 million tons, along with 175 Allied naval vessels. More than 30,000 Allied merchant seamen died. On the German side, out of the approximately 40,000 men who served in U-boats during the war, fewer than 10,000 survived. Roughly 330 U-boats were lost at sea. The campaign that Dönitz had calculated as potentially war-winning had instead become one of the most devastating institutional losses in modern naval history. Lüth's 225,000 tons of shipping, remarkable as they were individually, represented, in the final tally, a single-digit contribution to a campaign that the side he was fighting for ultimately lost at enormous human cost. Chapter 13. The Ships That Didn't Come Home. The cost in human terms, I want to be honest about something. This chapter is harder to write than the chapters about Lüth, because the people in it don't have names I can give you. They don't have decorated careers, translated lectures, or biographies published by naval institutes. They are the crews of the merchant vessels that Lüth and the other U-boat commanders sank. The men who were on the other end of the calculation. The documented record of Lüth's career lists ships and tonnage and dates. It does not, in most cases, list the names of the men who were on those ships. That asymmetry in the archive is itself a kind of historical fact, and it's worth sitting with. The working life of a merchant mariner in the Second World War was one of the least understood and least publicly commemorated aspects of the conflict. These men were not members of any armed force. They were civilian sailors, engineers, deckhands, cooks, radio operators, navigators, who kept the supply lines open because without them the war simply couldn't be fought. Britain's food supply, its fuel, its raw materials, its military equipment, all of it moved by ship. When the U-boats sank those ships, the practical effect cascaded from the immediate loss of life through to shortages on shore, disruption of military operations, and the constant background pressure that shaped Allied strategic decisions at the highest levels. The conditions in which merchant sailors died deserve more than a number. When a freighter was struck by a torpedo in the North Atlantic in midwinter, the immediate problem was not the explosion. It was the water temperature. The North Atlantic in January runs somewhere around 4 degrees Celsius. Immersion in water at that temperature begins incapacitating a person within minutes. Effective use of limbs, which you need to board a lifeboat, to bail, to signal for help, degrades faster than most people understand. A man in the water in full winter gear in the North Atlantic had, statistically, a very limited time before hypothermia was advanced enough to prevent self-rescue. Lüth's logbook entry about the 5 survivors of the Empire Lake, floating in the South Atlantic with high seas running, was probably accurate in its clinical prediction. That's the worst part of reading it. The men who served in Allied naval escorts, the corvettes, frigates, and destroyers that shepherded convoys across the Atlantic, also lived and died in conditions that are difficult to fully communicate at a documentary remove. A Flower-class corvette running in heavy North Atlantic weather rolled in ways that sent men flying across compartments. Standing watches on an open bridge in a North Atlantic winter meant exposure to cold and spray for 4-hour stretches. Hot food was often unavailable in heavy weather because the galley fires had to be extinguished. Anti-submarine operations required sustained concentration, listening, plotting, evaluating, making rapid decisions about whether a sonar contact was a U-boat or a temperature layer or a school of fish. Under physical conditions that degraded concentration continuously, the Allies eventually won the Battle of the Atlantic. They won it expensively and by increments. And a great deal of what that cost actually looked like was written in the bodies of men who served on both sides of the exchange. The German U-boat crews also deserve some accounting in this chapter because their mortality rate is one of the most extreme of any military unit in any army or navy in the Second World War. Out of roughly 40,000 men who served in U-boats between 1939 and 1945, somewhere between 28,000 and 30,000 died. That is a casualty rate approaching 75%. For context, Allied bomber crew mortality rates, which are often cited as among the worst of the air war, ran at roughly 45% for American 8th Air Force crews completing a tour. The U-boat arms death rate was substantially higher. These were not abstract statistics. They were men in their 20s, many of them volunteers, who understood to an increasing degree as the war progressed that the odds were heavily against their survival, and who went to sea anyway, for reasons of duty, of professional commitment, of ideology, of the particular institutional culture Lüth documented at Weimar, and probably all of those things in different proportions for different men. The thing that I find most difficult about the broader cost of the U-boat campaign is the simple fact that it accomplished none of its strategic objectives. More than 30,000 Allied merchant sailors died. Roughly 30,000 German submariners died. Britain was never blockaded into collapse, and the supply lines Dönitz intended to sever kept running. Damaged, reduced, periodically disrupted, but fundamentally unbroken. For the entire length of the war, the cost was extraordinary on every side. The strategic outcome of that cost, from the German perspective, was failure. That's not a judgment on the courage or the skill of the men who fought the campaign. Lüth's 205 days in the Indian Ocean don't become less technically demanding because they didn't change the final result. But the final result is also part of the record. Chapter 14, The Men Who Served Beneath Him. A submarine commander's legacy is, in a very real sense, shared property. Lüth did not sink 46 ships by himself. He commanded 50 men through months of submerged existence, and their sustained performance, the chief engineer keeping the diesels running, the watch officers maintaining accurate navigation, the torpedo petty officers maintaining weapons in conditions of heat and salt and pressure, made every patrol possible. The documented record gives us only a few individual names from among the men who served under Lüth. But those few names, and what we can reconstruct about the broader experience of U-181's crew, tell us something important about what his leadership actually looked like from the other side of the rank relationship. Carl August Landfermann served as chief engineer of U-181 across both major patrols. His Knight's Cross nomination, submitted by Lüth at the conclusion of the second patrol, speaks directly to the nature of his contribution. On a 205-day patrol in the Indian Ocean, the chief engineer is the man standing between the boat and mechanical catastrophe. Every diving cycle, every surface, every change in speed, every emergency, all of it passes through the engineering space. The damage U-181 sustained during the 9-hour engagement with HMS Inconstant on the first patrol didn't automatically repair itself. It was repaired at sea, under operational conditions, thousands of nautical miles from any dockyard. Landfermann's role in that repair, keeping the boat sufficiently functional to reach a friendly port, was as important to Lüth's career results as any individual torpedo solution. Lüth understood that. The nomination was, as I said earlier, a statement of accuracy. Johannes Limbach, nominated alongside Landfermann, served as second watch officer. The watch officer's function was, in operational terms, the most direct expression of the boat's tactical decision-making, below the level of the commanding officer. Standing a bridge watch at night, identifying and classifying contacts, making the judgment calls about when to call the captain. These were not bureaucratic tasks. They required experience, calm, and a willingness to take responsibility for decisions that could not wait for senior input. That Lüth trusted Limbach sufficiently to nominate him for the Kriegsmarine's highest decoration is a specific and documented statement of professional confidence. The two men had been sealed in a steel tube together for 7 months. That kind of assessment of a subordinate is not made lightly. The Weimar lecture is, among other things, a detailed portrait of an anonymous crew. Lüth doesn't name individuals in the lecture. It was addressed to fellow commanders, not to the men themselves. But the people he describes are clearly real. The young man who needed to feel that after punishment, he was once again a full member of the community. The crew member who had a talent for baking, and whose loaves were celebrated in the ship's paper with something Lüth compared to an election campaign. The man who read books throughout a long patrol, and whose private reading habit was noted with approval, because it kept him stable and occupied. The musicians who played when the record player was put on, the chess players, The card players whose scat game could be taken away as a disciplinary measure, precisely because it mattered enough to them to sting. These glimpses are frustrating in their incompleteness. We're seeing the crew through a single lens, Lüth's, and Lüth was describing them for a specific purpose, which was to argue a case about leadership methods to an audience of senior officers. His framing was necessarily selective. But even a selective portrait tells us something real. The crew of U-181 on the second patrol were men who had volunteered for the submarine service, endured months of technical training, deployed to the far end of the world in a pressure vessel the length of a large house, and to sustain their operational performance for more than 6 months without access to any of the things that make sustained human effort possible in normal circumstances. Fresh air, natural light, physical space, clean water, regular sleep, privacy. That they did this repeatedly, across the 2 major patrols, speaks to something. To the U-boat training pipeline's effectiveness, to Lüth's specific management, to the particular institutional culture of the service, and to whatever private reserves each man carried into the boat on sailing day. There is one specific crew account I want to note, because it illustrates something important about the texture of U-181's second patrol. Lüth described, at Weimar, an incident where a crew member caused a serious disciplinary problem during the long Indian Ocean deployment. Not something he details with full specifics, but one he uses to explain his system of onboard justice. His solution wasn't formal court-martial proceedings. It wasn't physical punishment. It was isolation within the community. A defined period of social exclusion, followed by full restoration of standing, with no residual grudge permitted from anyone on the boat. The logic was essentially institutional. You cannot afford a crew divided by festering resentment on a 7-month patrol. You resolve, you restore, and you move on. That's not sentimentality. That's the engineering of group cohesion under sustained stress. And it worked, evidently, because U-181 came back from 205 days, with its crew intact and its results documented. Chapter 15. What the archive tells us. Historiography, debate, and the human record. Every document has a context that shapes its meaning. The translated Weimar lecture lives at the U-boat archive online, accessible to anyone with an internet connection. But it exists because the Office of Naval Intelligence thought it was worth translating and distributing to American naval officers. That institutional decision, to circulate a German officer's lecture through Allied naval channels, tells us something about how the ONI read the document in the immediate post-war period. They read it primarily as a text about submarine leadership. They were right that it was that. They were also right that it was other things simultaneously. And the archive introduction's careful language reflects a later generation's more complete reading. Jordan Vows's biography, U-Boat Ace, the story of Wolfgang Lüth, published by the Naval Institute Press, remains the indispensable source in English. Vowsy was not writing hagiography. He engaged with the ideological content squarely, not as a footnote, but as a thread that runs through the career rather than around it. Michael Hadley's critique of Franz Kurowski's earlier German language treatment, describing it as pulp trade yarn and hackwork, points to a real problem in post-war German naval literature, where a genre of uncritical military biography emerged that cleaned the records of decorated officers into something more comfortable for a West German readership navigating its relationship to the recent past. Hadley named that problem clearly, and it's worth naming it here too, because it shaped what was available to English language readers who couldn't access the original German sources. The historiographical debate around Lüth specifically turns on the question of whether his ideological commitments can be separated from his professional achievements. Some readers following the American post-war naval tradition represented by Edward Beech's reported engagement with the ONI translation, have argued for a kind of professional separability, that the leadership methods are independently valuable and can be extracted from their ideological wrapping. Others have argued that the ideological content isn't a wrapping at all, but is deeply embedded in the logic of the methods themselves. That a system of crew management designed to produce sustained operational performance in service of a genocidal regime is not neutrally transferable to other contexts without moral laundering. I find the second argument more compelling, if less convenient. The lecture can be read and studied. It should be read as what it is, in its entirety, not curated into something tidier. The question of Lüth's death, accidental, at the hands of his own sentry, in the final days of a war already lost, is one that writers have sometimes framed as irony, as tragedy, as bathos. I don't find any of those framings quite adequate. What actually happened was straightforward and requires no metaphorical loading. A young sentry followed his training. The rules were clear, and the result was fatal. The rules themselves were rules that Lüth had enforced and would presumably have enforced again. There is something in that, the system consuming its own architect. But I'm wary of turning it into meaning it doesn't quite have. It was a specific event, on a specific night, governed by specific standing orders. Seaman Gottlob was 18 years old and did what he had been trained to do. That's the event. What does survive in the documented record is U-181 herself. Or rather, what the record tells us about where she ended. After Germany's surrender in May of 1945, U-181 was at Batavia, present-day Jakarta, in waters that had been operationally Japanese for several years. She was formally transferred to the Imperial Japanese Navy on the 6th of May, 1945. On the 15th of July, 1945, she was renumbered I-501 and incorporated into the Japanese fleet. Japan surrendered on the 15th of August, 1945. I-501 fell into British hands at Singapore. On the 16th of February, 1946, the British frigates HMS Loch Glendu and HMS Loch Lomond scuttled her off Singapore. The boat outlasted her most famous commander by 9 months. There is something I keep returning to about the arc of this story. Lüth was born in Riga in 1913, into a Baltic German community that was already living at the edges of its historical moment. He joined the navy of a country that wasn't quite his country of origin. In the same month, that country's most destructive political movement came to power. He spent the best professional years of his life sealed inside steel cylinders in some of the most remote waters in the world, commanding men he couldn't replace, operating machinery he couldn't adequately repair, pursuing a strategic campaign that was already structurally lost before the Indian Ocean patrols began. He was good at all of it. Technically precise, humanly perceptive, organizationally gifted. He was also a documented adherent of an ideology whose full cost he probably never personally reckoned. He died at 31, shot in a dark courtyard, 5 days after the war ended. The archive doesn't give us a resolution. It gives us documents, a lecture, a patrol record, a torpedo log, a Knight's Cross citation, a court-martial finding, a death registration. It gives us Jordan Vor's careful reconstruction from those documents. It gives us the ONI translation with its careful introductory language. It gives us a scuttling order off Singapore in February of 1946, and a sentry's testimony that he had called out 3 times. I've tried to read those documents without resolving what they don't resolve. What they give us is a life that was genuinely capable and genuinely implicated. Not one or the other, but both, completely, at the same time. That's the record. It's enough. I started this project looking at a photograph of a man standing on a bridge, watching the horizon. I still can't read his expression. I don't think the archive can tell me. What I can tell you is what he did before and after that photograph. The patrols, the lectures, the nominations, the boat handed over in a distant port, the sentry who didn't know who was approaching in the dark. That's the history. That's what stayed in the documents when everything else faded. And if you've spent this much time with it, all the way from Riga in 1913 to Flensburg in May of 1945, then you've done the same work I did. You've sat with the contradictions and let them be contradictions. That's all any serious history can ask of you. Chapter 16, The Wolfpack Doctrine. How the U-boat war was actually fought. Before we can fully understand what made Lüth's career exceptional, we need to understand the system he operated inside, because the U-boat war was not simply a collection of individual commanders hunting independently. It was, at least through its middle period, a coordinated strategic campaign built around a specific tactical doctrine that Karl Dönitz had been developing since the 1920s. That doctrine was the Rudeltaktik, the Wolfpack, and it fundamentally shaped the context in which every U-boat commander, including Lüth, learned his trade, found his targets, and eventually confronted the limits of what submarines could achieve against an adaptive enemy. The Wolfpack concept was elegant in its basic logic. A single submarine, operating alone, could attack one convoy and then be hunted. Multiple submarines, spread across a patrol line hundreds of nautical miles wide, could detect a convoy with one boat, report it to headquarters, and then concentrate several boats on the target simultaneously. The convoy escort, designed to deal with a single submarine threat, would be overwhelmed. Depth charges falling on one bearing couldn't protect against torpedoes coming from another. The math, on paper, was compelling. In practice, the execution required something that proved more fragile than the theory assumed. Radio communication. Every Wolfpack signal, every position report, every headquarters directive broadcast on long wave. All of it was a transmission that could be detected, fixed, and decoded. Lüth's relationship to the Wolfpack system was somewhat oblique, and this is worth noting. His most productive patrols, particularly the U-181 Indian Ocean deployments, were fundamentally independent operations rather than coordinated pack attacks. The distant water Type IXD boats that went south and east were operating well beyond the range of effective Wolfpack coordination. They found targets through independent navigation and tactical judgment, not through BDU-directed convergence on a located convoy. This difference in operational mode is part of why Lüth's leadership methods were so distinctive. He was running a self-contained unit for months at a time, without the kind of operational framework that North Atlantic Wolfpack commanders could rely on. Every decision was local. Every problem was his. The technological dimension of the Wolfpack's failure is one of the most important and most technically specific stories of the entire war at sea. Dönitz's headquarters communicated with boats at sea via long-wave radio, frequencies that could penetrate seawater to shallow depth and that could be received by submarines running near the surface. The British government code and cipher school at Bletchley Park, working with captured Enigma material and continuous cryptanalytic effort, was periodically reading German naval traffic. The operational consequences of this were not immediate or consistent. The intelligence picture had gaps. The decryption was not always timely, but over the course of the war, it meant that Allied convoy routing was periodically adjusted based on knowledge of U-boat patrol line positions. Convoys went around threats that the German commanders believed were secret. The wolves found empty water where the sheep were supposed to be. The introduction of centimetric radar in Allied escort vessels and aircraft was the technological blow from which the Wolfpack never recovered. The earlier German Metox radar detector worked against metric wavelength radar sets. When Allied aircraft began using 10-centimeter ASV Mark III radar sets, the METOX gave no warning. U-boat commanders surfacing at night to recharge their batteries, a necessity since their electric motors ran only a limited distance submerged, began being attacked without warning from aircraft they never detected. Reports came back to BDU of boats suddenly under air attack in conditions of apparent safety. The instrument meant to protect the boats was blind to the threat. The tactical situation deteriorated faster than the technical response could keep pace with, and Black May was the result. For Lüth, operating in the Indian Ocean through the worst of Black May, the immediate impact of the Wolfpack's Atlantic collapse was felt primarily as a strategic pressure. The hunting grounds that had made his career were shrinking. The distant water option that U-181 represented was partially a response to the deteriorating North Atlantic situation, and the men at BDU who sent Lüth south understood that the center of gravity was shifting. What they couldn't fully account for was how quickly Allied capability would expand into the new operational areas. The Indian Ocean of late 1943 was not the Indian Ocean of late 1942. The margin kept compressing. Lüth's second U-181 patrol, for all its record-setting endurance, was fought in conditions that were getting harder every month. That context belongs in the record alongside the tonnage figures. What the Wolfpack era also produced, almost incidentally, was the most intensely documented body of submarine leadership literature to emerge from any navy in the war. Because BDU expected its commanders to lead independently for extended periods, it needed to select and train men who could manage small, closed communities under stress without institutional support. The thinking that produced Lüth's Weimar lecture was not an anomaly. It was the natural intellectual product of an organization that had to solve the human engineering problem of keeping men functional at depth in the dark for months at a time. That problem didn't end with the Wolfpacks. It outlasted the tactical doctrine by decades. Chapter 17, the Type IXD-2, the machine that made the record possible. Every record in military history is partly a record of the technology that made it achievable. Lüth's 205-day patrol didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in a Type IXD-2 submarine, and the specific capabilities of that boat were a direct enabling condition of everything the patrol achieved. Without understanding what U-181 was and what she could do, the operational story is incomplete. So let's spend some time with the machine itself. The Type Nike series was the German Navy's long-range ocean-going submarine, developed in parallel with the coastal Type 7 that dominated North Atlantic Wolfpack operations, where the Type Weick was optimized for range to cost efficiency in the relatively compact North Atlantic theater. The Type Nike was built for endurance, fuel capacity, stores capacity, and habitability at extended range were prioritized in its design. The Type IXA entered service in 1938. The IXB and IXC variants extended the design's range progressively. The IXD, of which U-181 was a Type IXD-2 variant, was a further extension specifically designed for very long-range operations in the Indian Ocean and Pacific. The Type IXD-2 was substantially longer than the standard Type Weick, roughly 87 meters against the Weick 67. She displaced approximately 1,610 tons surfaced. Her naval engines produced enough shaft horsepower to push her to around 19.5 knots on the surface. With an operational range of roughly 23,000 nautical miles at a cruising speed of 10 knots. That range figure is the critical one. 23,000 nautical miles is the difference between a boat that can reach Lorient from the Bay of Biscay and a boat that can reach the Indian Ocean, conduct extended operations, and return without reprovisioning. It made the distant water campaign conceptually possible. The habitability of the Type IXD was marginally better than smaller boats, which was essential for the patrol durations Lüth ran. Not comfortable. Nothing about a submarine of that era was comfortable, but better. Additional provision storage, slightly more generous crew space, improved ventilation systems relative to earlier designs. On a 205-day patrol, the difference between a crew that is merely miserable and a crew that becomes clinically dysfunctional is partly a function of the physical environment they're confined to. The designers of the IXD hadn't built a pleasure vessel. They had built a machine with enough margin to keep 50 men operational for the duration of time its fuel and stores permitted. That margin was what Lüth filled with chess tournaments, ships' newspapers, baking competitions, and Sunday hymns. The weapons fit of the IXD-2 was formidable. 22 torpedoes carried, with 6 torpedo tubes, 4 forward and 2 aft. 105mm deck gun forward of the conning tower, plus anti-aircraft armament. The deck gun mattered enormously to Lüth during the U-181 patrols, particularly after torpedo stocks were depleted, or when the tactical situation favored surface engagement against smaller or disabled targets. A number of the kills during the Indian Ocean patrol period were achieved with the deck gun rather than torpedoes, a choice that required surfacing, which required calculated acceptance of vulnerability, which require a commander willing to make aggressive tactical judgments in conditions that couldn't always be fully assessed. Maintenance on an IXD-2 during a patrol of this length was a continuous, grinding operational reality. Diesels accumulate wear, seals degrade, the pressure hull systems, the vents, the ballast tank mechanisms, the periscope bearings, all require regular attention and occasional emergency repair. The 9-hour engagement with HMS Inconstant during the first U-181 patrol produced damage that was repaired at sea, which means Landferman and his engineering department were conducting work under operational conditions that a peacetime naval architect would have considered dockyard only. The fact that the boat made Lourenco marks under her own power afterward is a statement about the engineering team's competence as much as it is about Lüth's navigation. There is one specific technical point I want to make about the IXD-2 and the Indian Ocean that doesn't always appear in popular accounts. The tropics were hard on the machinery and harder on the men. North Atlantic operations, brutal as they were in terms of weather and sea state, were conducted in cold water, which helped preserve food longer and reduced the physical strain of heat on both men and machinery. The Indian Ocean ran warm. Food spoiled faster. Humidity inside the boat was punishing. Condensation on the hull surfaces made the living spaces perpetually damp. Skin conditions, fungal infections, and heat-related fatigue were routine complaints on tropical patrols. Managing a crew through 205 days in those conditions required attending to physical health as well as psychological morale, and the Weimar lecture's attention to diet, routine, and individual welfare wasn't abstract personnel theory. It was the applied solution to a specific tropical problem. Chapter 18. Dönitz, Lüth, and the command relationship Karl Dönitz appears repeatedly at key moments in Wolfgang Lüth's career. At the Wolf's Lair presentation, at the Flensburg funeral, in the radio signals that announced decorations to a submarine in the Indian Ocean. But the relationship between Dönitz and his commanders is worth examining specifically, but because it shaped the context in which Lüth operated, and because the institutional culture Dönitz built around the U-boat service left distinctive marks on everything Lüth did and documented. Dönitz commanded the U-boat arm from its re-establishment in 1935 until January of 1943, when he was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine following Raeder's resignation. His relationship with his commanders was, by all documented accounts, unusually direct and personally engaged for a senior military officer. He knew his commanders by name, followed individual patrol results closely, and made himself personally accessible in ways that larger fleet commands typically couldn't sustain. When U-boat commanders returned from patrols, Dönitz would often debrief them personally. He attended the funerals of lost commanders when circumstances permitted. He cultivated, deliberately, a command culture in which the U-boat service felt like a distinct professional community, set apart from the broader Navy by its specialized demands and its peculiar combination of autonomy and sacrifice. The flip side of this personal engagement was a command culture that placed enormous weight on the individual commander's judgment and nerve. Wolf pack coordination required radio contact with BDU, but the actual tactical decisions at sea were the commanding officers. No one at headquarters could see what a commander on a bridge at night was seeing. No one could assess the sea state, the visibility, the convoy's speed and heading, the escort's behavior, the mechanical state of the boat. Dönitz expected his commanders to bring professional judgment to those decisions, and he explicitly resisted the kind of micromanagement from shore that characterized some other naval command structures. This expectation of autonomous professional judgment is exactly the disposition that Lüth's Weimar lecture documented from the inside. The capacity to make sound decisions with incomplete information under stress without recourse to higher authority. Where the command relationship became more complicated was in the area of ideological expectation. Dönitz was not simply a professional naval administrator. He was, by the documented record, ideologically committed to the regime and its aims in ways that went considerably beyond the kind of formal compliance that many Wehrmacht officers maintained while privately maintaining distance. His post-war trial at Nuremberg resulted in a 10-year sentence, and the debate among historians about the appropriate assessment of his wartime conduct remains genuinely unsettled. The short version: he ran the U-boat service with considerable professional skill, and he did so in full service of a regime whose aims he appears to have genuinely shared. Lüth operated within that command culture, was shaped by it, and expressed it publicly in ways that exceeded the minimum required. Both men were, in the documented record, ideologically consistent with the regime they served. The December 1943 Wolf's Lair visit, when Lüth and other officers received their decorations from Hitler directly, was not unusual in its form. Senior decorated officers were regularly summoned for such presentations. What the visit represented institutionally was the regime's investment in the U-boat service as a public symbol of German military capacity at a moment when the war news was becoming difficult to manage. The North Atlantic had been lost in May. The Italian front was opening. Stalingrad was 6 months in the past. Against this backdrop, the Navy's most decorated submarine commander receiving the diamonds at the Wolf's Lair was a propaganda event as much as it was a military ceremony. Lüth understood that. Dönitz understood that. The regime's investment in visible military heroism intensified precisely as the strategic situation deteriorated. The Flensburg period, with Dönitz as nominal Reichspräsident and Lüth as Academy commandant, represents the final compression of that relationship. Two men whose careers had intersected repeatedly, now at the last functioning address of a collapsed state, trying to maintain institutional routine in the absence of any coherent future. Dönitz gave the eulogy at Lüth's funeral with whatever personal and institutional weight he could still command in that extraordinary moment. The British gave permission. The ceremony happened, and then the Flensburg government itself dissolved 2 weeks later. Dönitz was arrested, and the institutional structure that had defined both men's careers ceased to exist entirely. Chapter 19: The Merchant Sailor's War. The other side of the logbook Every entry in Lüth's patrol log that records a ship sunk represents a corresponding entry in a different kind of record. The records kept by shipping companies, by Allied naval commands, by insurance underwriters, and eventually by historians who spent decades cross-referencing losses against claims. Those records tell a different story than the patrol log. They tell the story of the ships as ships, their routes, their cargoes, their crews, the specific circumstances of their loss. And reading them alongside the U-boat patrol records produces a kind of stereo picture that neither record can provide alone. Take the merchant vessel Gunda, sunk by Lüth in January of 1940. His first confirmed kill on U9. She was a Swedish steamer. In January of 1940, Sweden was nominally neutral, its merchant fleet still sailing under its own flag in waters that were becoming more dangerous by the day. The crews of neutral vessels occupied a peculiar legal and practical position in the early war, sailing under the protection of their country's neutrality while operating in waters where that protection was becoming increasingly theoretical. The submarine commanders who sank neutral ships were not acting illegally by the rules of unrestricted submarine warfare as Germany then practiced it. They were acting within a declared policy of which every neutral nation's merchant fleet was aware. That doesn't make the experience of the men on Gunda less immediate or less dangerous. The cargo dimension of the merchant war is one that gets less attention than it deserves. The ships Lüth and the other U-boat commanders were sinking, were not sailing empty. They carried foodstuffs, fuel, ammunition, vehicles, aircraft, raw materials, the material substance of a war economy that needed constant transfusion to function. When a tanker went down in the western approaches in 1940, the oil in her tanks didn't simply disappear from the strategic equation. It was oil that wasn't heating homes in Britain through the winter, wasn't fueling the aircraft that needed to fly, wasn't reaching the refineries that kept the logistics chain running. The tonnage war was, at its foundation, a war about what was in the holds as much as it was about the number of ships. The human geography of the Allied merchant marine was more diverse than popular representations typically capture. British merchant sailors formed the largest single national group, but the convoys included men from across the Commonwealth, Canadian, Australian, South African, Indian, West African, Caribbean sailors serving on British registered vessels, Norwegian ships and crews who had escaped to Allied ports after the German occupation of 1940, continued sailing throughout the war, their country's merchant fleet making an extraordinary per capita contribution to the Allied supply effort. Dutch sailors, Greek sailors, American sailors. After December of 1941, the convoys were multinational human enterprises, and their losses were felt across all those communities simultaneously. What the merchant sailors experienced when a ship was torpedoed was, in the documented survivor accounts, deeply variable. Some ships went down quickly enough that survival depended entirely on where you were at the moment of impact. A man in the engine room when a torpedo struck the machinery spaces had virtually no chance. A man on the bridge might have enough warning to reach a lifeboat. Others sank slowly enough that organized abandoned ship procedures could work, provided the sea state permitted it, and the escort vessels were close enough to pick up survivors before exposure became fatal. The documented case of the 5 survivors of the Empire Lake, noted in Lüth's own logbook, represents the worst scenario. Survivors afloat, far from land, in conditions that made rescue improbable. The logbook entry doesn't tell us whether they were, in fact, rescued. The absence of that information is itself a kind of answer. The post-war accounting of merchant marine casualties was complicated by the fact that many merchant sailors were not military personnel in the formal sense. Their deaths weren't recorded through the same institutional channels as naval or army losses. and the documentation was consequently patchier. Efforts to establish accurate casualty counts continued for decades after the war ended. The figure most often cited, approximately 30,000 Allied merchant sailors killed, is almost certainly an undercount of the actual loss, because not all nations maintained records of comparable completeness, and some vessels went down without any survivors to report their own fate. The sea doesn't always return evidence. Chapter 20, The Long Shadow. What Lüth's story means now. History doesn't end when the people in it stop moving. It continues in the archives, in the biographies, in the arguments between historians, in the specific decisions made about what to translate, what to teach, and what to quietly let recede. Wolfgang Lüth died in May of 1945. The documented record of his career has had more than 80 years to accumulate interpretation, and the interpretive arguments that surround him, about leadership, about our ideology, about the separability of professional skill and moral context, are not resolved. They are, if anything, more clearly defined now than they were in the immediate post-war period. The fact that his Weimar lecture was translated by the Office of Naval Intelligence and circulated within American naval channels is one of the most interesting institutional decisions in the archival trail. It represents an early and largely undiscussed instance of something that became a recurring post-war pattern. Allied military establishments studying the methods of defeated adversaries for applicable professional knowledge, while maintaining a working distance from the ideological framework those methods had served. The German army's operational techniques were studied. The Luftwaffe's air combat doctrine was analysed. Lüth's leadership framework was translated and distributed. In each case, the institutional logic was professional extraction. Take what works, discard the context. The question that historians like Michael Hadley raise is whether that extraction is ever as clean as the extracting institution believes it to be. The post-war German naval literature on Lüth illustrates a different version of the same problem. Franz Karofsky's hagiographic treatment, which Hadley described as hackwork, was part of a broader genre of West German military memoir and biography that served a specific cultural function, allowing a society to take pride in the military professionalism of its recent past while carefully bracketing the regime that professionalism had served. The U-boat commanders in this genre became figures of individual heroism and technical virtuosity uncomplicated by ideology. Lüth's diamonds and his record patrol were foregrounded. The passage about jazz and Jewishness was not. This wasn't simply dishonesty. It was a cultural coping mechanism, but it produced a historiographical distortion that more rigorous scholarship, including Vohr's biography and Hadley's critique, spent subsequent decades correcting. What Jordan Vohr's produced in U-Boat Ace was, within the constraints of the documented record, something closer to the actual complexity. A portrait that acknowledged Lüth's genuine professional gifts, without sanitizing the ideological content, and that took seriously the question of how both things inhabited the same person without pretending to resolve it. That kind of biographical honesty is harder to write than either hagiography or condemnation. It requires sustained attention to the primary sources, the patrol records, the lecture transcript, the decoration citations, the court-martial findings, and a willingness to let the contradictions remain visible rather than forcing them into a narrative that provides false coherence. The men who served under Lüth, Land, Vermann, Limbach, and the 50 others whose names the public record largely doesn't preserve have their own relationship to this legacy. And it's one we can only speculate about because their testimony, if it was ever given in documented form, hasn't made its way into the publicly accessible archive. What the Weimar lecture tells us, indirectly, is that Lüth believed his crews respected him and that he respected them. whether that was reciprocal, whether the men who came back from 205 days in the Indian Ocean felt the same way. We don't entirely know. The command relationship is the most documented relationship in the naval archive. The crew's relationship to the command is substantially less so. In Flensburg today, the Naval Academy Mürwik still exists. It is still a naval academy. The Deutsche Marine, Germany's present-day navy, uses it as its officer training school. The building that housed Dönitz's brief Flensburg government, where Lüth walked the grounds as commandant, where Seaman Gottlob stood his post on the night of the 13th of May, 1945, is still standing on the western shore of the Flensburg fjord. The institution has continued. The navy it produces serves a very different state and a very different constitutional order than the one Lüth served. The building carries its history the way buildings do, silently, in its dimensions and its placement, available to those who look for it, and unremarkable to those who don't. Lüth is buried in a military cemetery. His grave is documented. The record of his career, the patrol logs, the decoration citations, the lecture transcript, the court-martial ruling, sits in archives accessible to researchers. His story has been written once, carefully in English, by Jordan Vorse. It has been written carelessly in German by Franz Kurowski. It has been argued over in footnotes by historians who care about getting the details right, which is the most useful argument a footnote can contain. What it hasn't been, perhaps, is told at the length and pace that lets all of those layers breathe. The professional and the personal, the technical and the human, the record of achievement and the record of what that achievement cost and served. That's what this documentary has attempted. Not to condemn Lüth, not to celebrate him, but to account for him. In full, at depth, with the documentation in hand and the contradictions intact. That's the only kind of history that earns the weight of the subject.